are you, Nancy? Long time no see.
Yeah, great. Just fine.
How's your place?
That's pretty good, That's the back of it.
Ooh, fabulous.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
Just letting everyone know we're going to start recording, and this is also streaming live onto Facebook. But I'll remind everyone here in a minute too. Just letting you know that.
So make sure to have a big old smile because we're going to be recording that all the time.
Yes.
And just so you know, I mean, the reason of recording is so we can have an opportunity for other people to be able to watch it later on in our website and globaltiesabq.org. So that's the reason why we like to record it, and we're going to start recording it right now. And just so you know, I mean, the reason of recording is so we can. Yeah, that's perfect. So it's 2 p.m. and we're just gonna wait a few minutes for more people to join. So we, Destiny and myself, we were having a conversation really quick before, and we were talking that if we were gonna be doing some music, so everybody gets all pumped up or something, so it's not like that silence sometimes waiting for those 5 minutes. So Destiny had a beautiful idea. So we want to ask you one question because we don't have, we only have 4 minutes, and feel free to please put it in the chat. The other thing really quick is that we're going to be muting you all. Sometimes we have doggies or we have the husband, fighting or something. The wife fighting. And so the question really quick is, when all of these pandemic it's done, where would you like to travel next? Which country would you like to visit? So feel free to add. Oh, here it is.
Laura didn't even have to think about that one.
Love it.
I already got my ticket waiting.
Oh,
I had to postpone it twice now, but I'm going.
That's amazing. All right. So who visit when basically it's open to the world will come back to be open again? Just you can type it on the chat. So we have Panama, New Zealand, India, and UK. I love it. I was born and raised in Mexico, so I guess just going to Mexico will be, hey, it's another country, so that will be perfect for me. All right, so for those of you that just they're joining, we have a quick question before we get started at 2:05 with a conversation with Ms. Rebecca Black, which thank you so much, Ms. Rebecca, for doing this for us. Oh, sorry. And so the question is, when the pandemic hopefully ends, which country would you like to visit? You can add please your answer to the chat. It will be great. Yeah. Okay, so we have France and Tunisia. And when we have, what else? France. So we have a lot of France. Last time I was there, that was almost 2 years ago. And do you guys know that it's actually Paris is the most visited city in the world? I wonder why. Champagne is really good. And macarons, and of course, what else? The croissants and the coffee. Yeah, we have France. I think France is gonna be the winner. So we're gonna be giving away a trip to France. Just kidding. Just keep answering your questions and we'll be begin really, really soon. 1 more minute.
Yeah, just a reminder for everyone as well, we are recording this session and we have it streaming live on Facebook as well. So we can go watch it if you want. It's weird to watch it because it's lagged on if you're watching from the live, but just by a couple seconds.
Perfect. So we have Italy. Yes, it's beautiful. Italy, the wonderful wine and making me hungry. Pizza, of course, the good pizza. I usually don't eat pizza. I don't like it, which is a good thing. But then I mentioned to my friends that if I ever want to eat pizza, I have to go fly to Italy. So that's gonna be next. All right, it's officially 2:05, so we would like to get started. On behalf of Global Ties ABQ, we would like to welcome Ms. Rebecca Black. Thank you so much for your willingness to help us with Global Ties ABQ. My name is Yuridia Morales. I'm your executive director with this amazing organization. And as you guys know, we bring international visitors to the city of Albuquerque, to this beautiful and unique city and state. And right now, as everybody is doing the same, that we need to switch to virtual events. So for this reason, thank you so much. And Rebecca and we were discussing and which will be the best topic to talk, because we've had other different topics. And I was reading about her life, and I gotta say congratulations, and you're an impressive woman. Everything that you have done for the country and everything, like living in different countries, representing basically the US. Congratulations to all the beautiful and wonderful work that you have done. Congratulations. So, and I would rather, if that's okay with you, Rebecca, would you please share with us before we get started in your topic about this interesting topic, COVID-19, and specifically in some countries in Africa. Would you please share with us about your life and what is it that you do? I know that you worked 25 years as a the foreign service officer, so that's amazing. So please, if you can share with us, where were you? What do you do? Where do you live? What kind of work that you did? That would be wonderful.
Okay, well, thank you very much. First, I'm a big fan of Global Ties, as you know, and it's particularly interesting because, like many foreign service officers, I help nominate candidates for some of the people that came to the U.S. So it's very interesting to see what happens to them when they come, and I'm very impressed at the amount of volunteerism that goes on. So about me, I started off, I guess I've always been interested in development and how people, cities, countries develop, what makes them move forward. Initially, I worked in the US in Boston, neighborhood development, and then worked for the city side, the city government, helping other communities within the city do their work to make their neighborhoods better. Then I realized that sort of as a white professional working in poor neighborhoods in Boston, wasn't necessarily that different than being an American working overseas. So that some of the same dynamics and the good and the bad, and decided that I really was interested in being overseas. To confess, I'm a daughter of a foreign service officer. So it's in the family a little bit, so I knew about it. There was 25 years between when my father retired and I joined. But I wanted very much to go to Poland, as during the early 90s when there was major transformation going on in what was then called Eastern Europe. So Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Albania were all countries I worked in, mostly developing local government, because that was a piece that was really missing under the communist system. I then went to South Africa at sort of the post-Mandela era. So after all of the euphoria of democracy, people realizing how difficult it really was to make a more equitable society when you have a very unjust one. A lot of work. And at the same time, HIV/AIDS started to boom. So even though I was working in urban environment, working on financing municipal infrastructure, I, like everybody else, got involved with HIV. And so we were looking at the impact on municipal workers, cemetery, the need for more space for cemeteries, looking at housing finance and what disease like HIV would do to the mortgage markets or things like that. So I was there 4 years and then went to India, which is by far the most exotic place I can think of on the planet, the most diverse, and worked on a number of broad range of economic growth programs. So that was everything from capital market development, regulating health insurance industry, including micro health insurance, urban infrastructure, agribusiness, small business, a whole range of activities. And a lot of it was around infrastructure, particularly water. So I spent a lot of time in my career talking about toilets and sanitation. So that continued in India. I then went back to Washington for a year and was so, found Washington so difficult that I escaped by going to Afghanistan for a year. So that was in 2009, 2010 with the big buildup. Definitely the most bizarre and fascinating experience. Very complicated, but worked, at that point I was the deputy director for the program, and so worked across all the different sectors. And one of the things that impressed me a lot was our work with training young women from very rural villages to be midwives, because a lot of women had no options in terms of giving birth, and so at least they could get some help. So I think there were some successes, despite what's going on in the future. From there, I went to Mali, West Africa, which is a landlocked country, relatively poor. Niger River runs through it. I was there for 2 years, working on very basic programs as the director, agriculture, education, health, environment. But the second year I was there was a major set of crises, starting with a coup d'etat where the president was deposed, which in turn turned into the fall of the north, to the Tuareg, to the rebels, who then were taken over by the Al-Qaeda of the Maghreb. So a lot of struggles in the north, then followed by economic problems, closing of the borders, disturbance of markets, and a drought. So major food insecurity problems. So though it was very difficult and we had to send most staff and all families away, it was very interesting to see the interplay of humanitarian assistance and how that works, both in the US and with other countries, and long-term development. So after that, my last post was Cambodia, which I was there almost 4 years, and quite an interesting country. In between, Mali was really the first country that I'd been in that was highly dependent, and had been for decades, on international assistance. So a very different relationship than in other countries where our money wasn't so important, but our technical expertise was, or what we could offer besides money. In Mali, money mattered. Cambodia was sort of in between. It was a poor country still, but like most Asian countries, developing very quickly. So rapid growth, much improvements. By the time I was there, the vast majority of people were born after the genocide from the Khmer Rouge era. There had been stability in the country for 20 years. And in terms of health, there was a health system that worked relatively well that came from absolutely zero in 1980. So an interesting aspect. So since then, I've moved to New Mexico, done a few assignments overseas, but mostly spent more time getting involved with organizations as a volunteer.
You know, impressive, really, an impressive career. And once again, congratulations. You know, later on, you and I, we can sit down for a coffee, wine, or champagne, or anything, so we can continue talking about, you know, culture, and you have the opportunity to live in different countries. And what I love the most, that out of being around the world, being director and representative of this beautiful country, so you are in New Mexico. So you live right here in the land of enchantment. So that's absolutely amazing. So now going to the topic, Rebecca, COVID-19. That's something that is been so interesting. Every day we see so many changes, reactions, leadership. We can go with every single country, you know, how they have reacted and or not, and the problems that they have, you know, they continue to face, including our own country right here, the different states leadership. But that's the main idea. And let me ask you, so with all your experience in COVID-19 in Africa, in different countries, and in Africa, but in Niger in particularly. Why that topic? And after that, the floor is all yours, because I know you have a presentation. So, but interested, just like why that in particular? Why Africa? Why Niger?
Well, I have to thank Santa Fe World Affairs Forum actually for the idea, because when I talked to Pat a while ago, I had just spoken to the director of a program which I'm on the board of an organization called RAIN for the Sahel and Sahara. So it's a small nonprofit based in the US, but works with nomadic girls, the nomadic region of Niger. Niger is a country which is east of Mali. It's also landlocked. It has the Niger River on the western edge. Very poor. It buys between Afghanistan and Yemen for the poorest in the world. But this organization is particularly working in an area that doesn't get a lot of support, and with a population which is quite difficult because they are historically nomadic. So in the process of being on the board, we were looking at what was happening with COVID-19 in Africa and Niger, talked to the director there and learned about all the complications. And so that gave me an insight into at least what was going on, in a very hands-on insight to what's going on in Niger, and then looking across the board at Africa. So I really got interested in it, mostly because Africa is doing a much better job than we are. The Center for Strategic International Studies, in fact, said they've just across the board, Africa has been better organized, better informed, and better implemented than many of their Western counterparts. And certainly if you look at the numbers. So that led to the interest in proposing this. And when I gave the talk in early June, there was just beginning to be speculation about things getting much, much worse. And when I was updating the data, it actually has gotten worse, but so has everyone else. So relatively, Africa stands the same. So should I go ahead with them?
And just really quick, one thing that Destiny pointed out. So you guys were supposed to be in France now in summer. For some reason, you had to get back to the US. So if you don't mind, at the end of your presentation, it will be amazing if you can share your own experience with being in France, with the places where it got started and then coming back to the US. But please go ahead and feel free to share your presentation.
Okay, well, it's a sore subject, leaving France, but we can talk about that later. Let me put this up. Oops. Sorry.
Oh, you're good.
There we go. Does that come up? Full screen? That'll be good. Okay, so we've been through the introduction. I'd say that there was, when COVID started, when people got out of their own isolation, started to look, or maybe because of their isolation, started to look outside of their own, the impact on themselves and their communities. People started looking around the world, and there was a lot of concern, a lot of talk about how Africa would be this total disaster. Predictions, WHO in April said that up to 44 million people in Africa would be infected with COVID, with up to 3 million deaths. Plus, on the other flip side, was if countries actually took action very quickly, then there would be a dramatic drive towards poverty. Especially people, they were estimating that 29 million people would fall back under extreme poverty, which is living below $2 a day. So there was this fear that Africa was caught in this downward spiral. These came for some good reasons. Africa is the epicenter of poverty, with the progress in China and to some extent in India with reduction of poverty. It's really Africa, sub-Saharan Africa is where the majority of the world's poor live. 27 of the 28 poorest countries are in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, with 41%, with most of those countries have over 30% poverty. In addition, there was known that there was already a shortage of water and sanitation. If the message is wash hands, when you need water, you need soap. And if you don't have those, that's extremely difficult. So with 300 million people in Africa without water and sanitation, major problem for stopping the infection. In addition, the health systems are generally quite poor. Obviously, in a continent of 54 countries, there's a lot of diversity, but in general, the systems are weak. An estimated 20,000 ICU beds total in the continent, and 3,500 ventilators. And this is in a continent of 1.3 billion people. A lot of concern about losing the growth in the last 15 years. There's been a lot of economic growth, 4.5% growth across the continent. Good progress, reduction in poverty by 15%. So major progress happening, and a great fear that that would all slip backwards. So that was the concern. But if we look at what's actually happened, this is data that's from the 19th, so a few days old, but definitely current. You'll see where we are worldwide, which is 14.4 million people infected with COVID across the world, 600,000 deaths. If you look at the red, you'll see very heavy in the US, as we know, in Latin America, Europe, parts of Asia, but Africa is relatively not so red infected. And in fact, if we look at the actual cases for a continent of over 1 billion people, there are only 721,000 cases, 15,000 deaths. So of course the numbers are suspect. The ability, even within the US and Europe, to really know exactly what's going on is compromised, but and certainly in many countries in Africa. But these numbers have stayed relatively consistent. Deaths, which would be the most likely to be reported, have not increased that much. And there is a relative sense that things are pretty under control. This is 5% of the world's total cases are in Africa. And most of those, that 700,000, are in very few countries. South Africa itself is responsible for over 300,000. So almost half of those are in South Africa. Part of that is ability to report, but also others. South Africa is much more like Latin America than some other countries. Niger, Nigeria, Algeria have also been heavily affected, in Egypt. But in general, you can see that it's a much better picture. Even now, even after a New York Times article in early June saying things were going to go out of hand, that Africa's doing pretty well. So why is that? Why would we think that this continent, which has got such a bad reputation generally, is doing so well? Part of it is demographics. It's a very youthful population in general. So to the extent that deaths are recorded more than infections, or there are fewer deaths, just given the health of younger people and the impact. Many of the countries are quite sparse. Populations are spread out, though there is a fair amount of urbanization in many large cities with slum areas as well. There's a lot less, it's low income, so people don't tend to go hang out in restaurants and bars and entertainment spaces where they would run into each other. But at the same time, you have a high rate of faith followers, Islam, Christianity, who go to churches. So it's a little hard to say it's all about conditions in Africa itself. Where I think this real story is the fact that the governments took action. Countries looked at what their own reality was and had a very clear view of what was possible. Most of the countries knew that their health systems were not adequate to deal with many people getting sick. So their only option was to prevent infection from spreading. So most of the programs were to take quick action. A lot of it was have the political leadership turn to their health ministers for advice. And it did not become a politicized issue. A few countries, Tanzania for one, has decided they're not interested in having a disease, so they're not even talking about it anymore. But for the most part, the African countries have looked to their health people to tell them what to do. They've also collaborated very well. The African Union, CDC, equivalent to our CDC, was established in 2017 after the Ebola pandemic. They set up an operations center in January of this year and immediately pulled together on a weekly basis the health ministers, virtual of course, talking about what conditions were in their particular countries, what information they had, what technologies, how they could share. They raised money. The Gates Foundation gave them $20 million for operations. And the CDC has played quite an active role. In February, I think 2 of the countries had an ability to do testing. Now over 45 have that ability. And a lot of that was through this coordination with CDC. Many of the countries used what they had in place. Community health workers on motorcycles, on bicycles, on foot were used to go out and spread the word about social distancing, about water and sanitation. I mean, very simple. It wasn't looking for fancy technologies, but to use what was there. Many African countries, unfortunately, and this maybe fortunately, have a lot of experience in dealing with health pandemics. Ebola got a lot of attention in 2014. It affected heavily a few countries. There were 28,000 total cases, but of those, almost a half were fatal. So much more serious disease, or much more fatal disease. HIV has been a chronic problem, particularly in Southern Africa, with 25 million people living with AIDS today in Africa, and on average, 1 million die every year of HIV. So that's continued to be a problem, but it is turning around. And so many countries have been learning over the last 20 years on how to deal with such a big pandemic. Let's see, a very quick action. As soon as the first cases came from Western Europe and the US, not from China, mostly hit the elite, because those are the people that either were traveling to those countries and coming back, or working with those people, but it's now spread beyond that. But immediately governments closed borders, they closed airports, they closed ports, they closed businesses, and started a massive social distancing campaign and wearing masks campaign. So very quick action. I thought it'd be worthwhile to give some specifics, some examples of what's been going on in addition to taking that action around lockdown. South Africa has focused heavily on testing. They're the 19th globally, which is pretty impressive. Really focused on that. Senegal's the Pasteur Institute in Dakar quickly went to work on a diagnostic test, and we know the ones here are quite expensive. So they have developed a test which is being used for $1 each. In addition, they did a medical robot who's been help alleviating some of the work on the health workers. Ghana is also in the process of having its antibiotic test reviewed through a regulatory process. Kenya converted a lot of factories to mass production, aiming to make tens of millions of masks with their capability. Rwanda went cashless. Rwanda's had quite a digital economy. It developed over the last 20 years. Totally cashless, reduced all the fees on mobile payments. Ghana is interesting. They have a zip line drones to bring samples to testing sites, something that the US then used and is brought back to the US, so it's a reverse transfer of technology. Many, as of here, schools were closed throughout, so close to 300 million students out of school, and many of these countries stepped up immediately, setting up e-learning platforms, but not just through the school system, but using the national broadcasters, telecom systems, and other means to get kids learning online, as well as packets of materials and even computers. South Africa set up a very sophisticated modeling consortium, which has been doing projections. Rwanda as well has this mathematical modeling, but that helped them start doing pool testing instead of individual testing, because they just didn't have the ability to get the test out. And also then we have Madagascar, who has been working on an organic remedy and now has trials going on in conjunction with WHO. So there's been quite a bit of action on the scientific technology side as well. I think one thing that people may find surprising is how much African countries do provide a social safety net for their impoverished population, for their poor population, and for local businesses. So there's been a lot of action from the governments to support their people and their businesses in terms of waiving fees for utilities, tax payment deferments, providing life insurance in Ethiopia, a lot of support for local businesses, support such as in Rwanda that set up a major feeding program, Tunisia provided grants for the unemployed. South Africa's unemployment income grants were increased. So a fair amount of support to their financial support to their people. Also, African businesses have really stepped up. It took, in a few days, Nigeria raised $65 million from their leading business people. South Africa's biggest families coming out of the mining industry, the Ruperts and Oppenheimers, have been contributing tons of money. And the Ethiopian richest man in Africa has also been contributing. So the private sector has stepped up as well. So it's generally an impressive view, and hopefully changes some of the perception about the basket case that some people still carry about their view of Africa. But it doesn't mean that there aren't major problems. When we talked to Bube, who's the director of the program in Niger for rain, it was very clear that the biggest impact is economic and on food. The government had closed down as much as they could, transportation, borders, but they couldn't close down the local markets because so many people rely on a daily trade business that it just it wasn't possible for people not to have that access. So 85% of African economy is informal, was estimated. So you have a whole way of doing business doesn't lead itself to a lockdown. In talking to Bube, since they worked with remote villages, a lot of those villagers are dependent on their livestock. Some of the livestock were sacrificed because of belief, hope, in order to try and bring safety, traditional way of dealing with the spirits, but also getting inputs, feed, food, everything, because many villages are totally dependent on food and medical supplies coming in from the cities. When those trade routes were cut off because of transportation lockdowns, they really suffered, and that included the inputs for agriculture, but also for their livestock. So the issue in Niger, they're under, I think, 500 cases in Niger and very few deaths, mostly in the city, in the capital city, but in the villages it's really about the economy, which is very true across the continent. Remittances have become much more important than international investment and assistance. That's someone in the family that works in West Africa or South Africa, somewhere that has a higher income, or in Europe, sending back that cash. And because those economies have shut down, people lost their jobs and that money's not coming back to the villages. Migration in South Africa, they did a study and showed that 15% of the population has moved somewhere in the country or somewhere out of the country. So a lot of movement of people trying to find some way of surviving. But another piece of it, and I'm not sure people realize, that Africa hosts 26% of the refugee population. So as a very poor continent in general, close to 18 million people are being given refuge. Niger itself, one of the poorest countries, has 160,000 refugees that it's taken in from Mali, Nigeria, from conflict areas around them, and they're supporting these people in refugee camps. Obviously, it's very difficult to bring food, to bring water and sanitation. Support from international programs was also cut back. The UN had to stop its air service for a while because of COVID. And so that's another huge burden that these countries have taken on. International networks, many of these countries are dependent on exports to Europe, to the US, to Asia, all of which have had reduced demand or difficulty getting their products out, so incomes are down. Growth rates are obviously slowed and losing ground, and not much foreign investment going on at the moment. So there was a study done in South Africa that was looking at the impact of COVID on what's happening to people in South Africa, and essentially close to 1 out of 3 have lost all of their income, with expectations that it's going to get much worse. 2 out of 3 million people are out of work, 2 million of whom are women. So there's also a major impact on women from losing jobs, tended to be more in the informal sector or low-paying jobs, which were cut through retail or tourism. There are also, apart from these more short-term impacts, there are long-term impacts. Major one is education, particular interest because that's a focus of RAIN in Niger, keeping girls in school. Some studies were done after the Ebola breakout and showed that when schools were closed, most often, many of the girls never returned. So once it's over, it's over. Families don't make the time or space for them to go back to school. Remote learning is very difficult. If a girl's at home, she's usually sent out to do errands or to do other household chores rather than stay on a computer to do learning, to do her studies. So it was quite difficult, especially for girls after Ebola, and we assume the same thing is going to happen with COVID. Funding for NGOs are down, which have been doing a lot of support. A huge problem with food insecurity for a lot of reasons. I don't know, last night on NPR, if you happen to be watching it, the head of the World Food Program, which is one of the major food provider in the world, was talking about the fact that there was a crisis beforehand. There's a major locust infestation in Ethiopia and Kenya, which is just devastating the crops. There's droughts and floods. There have been distribution problems. So they were predicting a food insecurity problem, which will probably double because of COVID. So going up to close to 265 million people who could be short of food. There was a study in South Africa showing that over half of the people living in the informal settlements in the slums don't have money for food today. So a major problem. And when you're very low income, 60 to 80% of your money goes to food. So when your income is cut, that means you have no food. The problem isn't just starvation now, it's also the impact on the long-term mental and physical growth. Malnutrition, that has a permanent impact on children. If they're not nourished well, as they grow, they will not physically or mentally develop. So it's a long-term impact on that. Vaccine campaigns, which have been quite successful, have been put on hold. Again, the fear of large gatherings of people, which is how a lot of the vaccinations were happening with these big, massive gatherings. So in fact, other diseases are going up. Measles started to show up in Central African Republic and in Nigeria. Malaria deaths are expected to go up again because the health services aren't out there. People can't get access to them. So there are other kind of health impacts as well. And for women, with the health systems closed down or inaccessible, it's also a huge impact on reproductive health. So women have been affected. Some studies show that some women have actually gained some dominance in terms of decision making in their family just because of changed roles. But in general, there's been increase in domestic violence, as there has been here. Digital divide, women are still way behind in terms of use and access to computers. And as I said, the access to health. So long-term picture is not great. And in addition to that, we have the growing xenophobia, just like here, the same thing in Africa. A number of countries like South Africa have immigrants who come from other countries and they're being repelled. Foreigners, Chinese, certainly Westerners, this is considered a Western disease initially. So there's been some discrimination against them. And certainly in China, there's continuing discrimination against Africans. Extremism, when you have a gap in governance and in service activity, and you have extremist groups, it's a great time for them to take advantage of it. In fact, between March and April, there was an increase of 37% increase of terrorist attacks just in that 1 month. Al-Qaeda is saying, they're sending out messages that the pandemic is God's wrath against the West because it started in the West. And then the Sahel, the Al-Qaeda network, kidnapped the major opposition leader in Mali. So a major problem with growing, and many of these groups are providing services and healthcare, stepping in, hoping to build support. So lastly, as we know, when there's a lot of money being pushed out the door quickly, there's a lot of temptations and a lot of corruption. Concern here, but certainly in Africa, and that would just undermine governance. So there are some very critical long-term concerns. So what's being done? The international community has stepped up. The African Union has said they will estimate over 200 billion to recover economically, as well as prepare for stronger health systems to deal with this pandemic and others. They have raised money from a variety of different sources. The European Union, France have stepped up considerably. The development banks, International Monetary Fund have all made loans, the World Bank, for programs related to economic and health impacts from this. funds have been reprogrammed, for instance, in the Global Fund for Vaccines for Gavi and immunizations. The problem with some of these is they're really, it's not an additional plus up, it is taking from one hand and feeding the other. So if you reprogram money from malaria programs or vaccinations, then you're going to have to be short on that side as well. So lastly, the US has done something. In the last, up to a few weeks ago, $1.5 billion has been used globally, and you can see here all the different countries that USAID and the State Department have provided worldwide. This is for surveillance systems, it's for information, it's for equipment. As you may have heard, President Trump had a big ventilator program, not always successful, but it was a focus. Training, laboratory strengthening, health and hygiene, and increasingly programs around food security and agriculture development. And presumably, hopefully, there will be continued economic growth. And this particular administration is very concerned about gender-based violence and sexual exploitation. So there's been a US focus on that. That essentially is my story. I first wanted to thank everybody for listening and participating. And just to say again, sort of why I wanted to do this. And it's Africa, 0.3 billion people, important continent, huge market for us, as well as source of imports. It looks like it's a good story. The country's leaderships have done what needed to be done in large part, and hopefully will continue to do that. But it's not going to get easier, and the economic impacts and food security impacts are going to be long term. So it's important not to forget about that. And Africa showed up in the news, I think, a number of times in May, but I haven't seen anything recently. So it comes and goes, but it doesn't mean that things aren't happening out there. So please keep watching what's happening. Things will get worse, and certainly economically. And it's important, as the director of WFP said last night, it's not only our moral obligation to people who are in trouble. COVID-19 came to Africa from the US and from Western Europe, so that's a piece of it. But it's also when people are in bad straits, not only do they starve, but they also look for anywhere they can move to migrate to, and also possible instability. So we do have our own interest in helping countries stabilize. So I did want to mention, so to plea generally, there's need for support to both push our government and other governments to continue to provide support to Africa and expand it, and to little organizations like RAIN that go into those far corners, which are very hard to reach by major programs. There is a bill, and there's an organization called Results, which advocates for poverty reduction in the US and globally. And they are pushing for a bill for the Senate COVID-19 emergency response bill to include $20 billion for global support for both direct support for the pandemic, but also for for hunger, for food security, to help stabilize other countries in the world. Just to remind you that, so 20 billion sounds like a lot of money, but the defense bill, last I looked at officially for the Defense Department, was $700 billion. So it's actually not that much compared to that. So anyway, thank you.
Wow, definitely a lot of knowledge, a lot of things that I personally didn't know, and I'm sure, you know, like a lot of people right now that are with us, it's just different questions that they might have. I personally have something, a comment that I would like to make. It's just really quick. My attention, it goes sometimes like I can get distracted like this. I have to tell you that I'm in an odd. Like I didn't get distracted at all. So I love and make a lot of notes, Rebecca. And I see some people, Jill in particular, asking some questions. So I would like, Jill, go ahead and you can ask the question yourself if that's okay with you.
Sure, that's fine. Thank you, Rebecca. I think it was a fabulous presentation. It was very interesting. Thank you. I had a couple of questions. One of the things that struck me on the last slide that you put up was to see that China was on the list to receive US AID funds. Do you know what those funds have been used for or where they're going in China?
I don't specifically. I know that there has been a very small, primarily health and HIV/AIDS program in China because it was considered a common interest. My guess might be ventilators. I'm not sure, but I can find out. I know it's a big blotch on the. Actually, no, China's not. China was not one of the countries. If you look at the.
Oh, was it? Oh, I thought that
No, it is not. Just looking again at the chart. I can go back.
Yeah. And while you're going back, I was also curious about the statement that you made about the visas and refugees in times of crisis. And I was curious about if we have competing goals and objectives between maybe U.S. aid and our State Department in terms of visa allotments. And was that something that you discovered where you've got those goals that are at odds with each other, or is that just something happening now?
I don't think I mentioned visas. I meant the refugees that were in Africa, African countries that were taking refugees from other countries.
Oh, I see. So from country to country within Africa.
Within Africa. These are like Niger has 160,000 refugees that they have taken in from surrounding country conflicts like Mali and Nigeria. So, I really didn't talk about visas. I would wish the U.S. would follow its commitments on the asylum seekers because that's the international law that we've agreed to. But anyway, it's a whole different subject. But now this was just talking about the fact that these countries that don't have a lot of resources are also providing support for people who have come to their country because they had to out of conflict. I mean, no, China is not part of the if you go back, I just put up the slide. It's the dark areas that are getting the assistance. So we have Russia and Kazakhstan. Is that up? Oh, I think I forgot to, sorry. I think I forgot to share it. Screen.
Up.
There we go.
Yeah, I see. It's
Yeah, no, it's around.
here. It is. So China's
countries around it, but not China. And there was a very small HIV/AIDS oriented program in China. Most of the attempt there is to try and work with them, but I'm around international assistance. But I think that has probably ended.
so only two countries in the continent of Africa looked as if they were grayed and not blued.
I would bet that's Equatorial Guinea. Let me go back. I just got rid of it. Yeah, I think that's Equatorial Guinea, and that's the Western Saharan.
Oh, south of
Morocco, which is kind of a contested territory. Yeah. And I think that might be. That's the Gambia. I'm not sure.
Interesting.
And Libya. Anyway, I can get more details on that if that's of interest.
I can see Greg in the back.
Yeah.
And we have time for, I will say one, hopefully two more questions. Luisa, I saw you raising your hand, so feel free to please ask Ms. Rebecca your question.
You're on mute. One sec. I can help you too.
I'm trying to share my screen.
Okay.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, ma'am.
Pardon me?
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Rebecca, for your insightful talk. I am a member of Results, and Rebecca did mention that we are very interested in ensuring that the Senate COVID bill, which should be introduced today or very soon, currently does not include any global funding. And as Rebecca has pointed out, there are huge concerns on a global level with famine and all kinds of health systems being not able to function fully if they don't get proper funding. So I guess my question is really a request, and that is to consider calling the Udall and Heinrich office and asking them to please support global funding in the Senate COVID bill that's coming up. Unfortunately, we have not heard either back from either Udall or Heinrich, but they are certainly usually very supportive of this. So I think more phone calls might help them. I'm sure they're both very busy. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Louisa. And real quick, I'm just going to shout out Bill Waldman from Senator Udall's office is actually on the call. So.
Oh, well, there you go.
Thanks, I was hoping you wouldn't notice.
That's great. Hi, Bill.
Hi, how are you, Louisa?
Heidi, say hi
So
too.
how would you target, if you have limited funds for an international effort, where would you target it? Rebecca, maybe you can help with that as well.
I think food security is going to be a huge issue. So that's both helping get agriculture inputs, including livestock feed. It's support for the international organizations like WFP, which tend to do a terrific job in getting immediate food out. But it's also long-term, and it's planting season. And without inputs, they're not going to have a harvest. So some of it is getting out really quickly. The health systems, generally, I think a lot of the concern is things like malaria are going to increase because there hasn't been the ability to get goods out, but also the attention, like here, is on COVID-19 and not on other diseases. And so maintaining that focus, not just on COVID, but on HIV, on malaria, on tuberculosis, which continues to be a huge issue in those countries. So some of it is sort of watching that and support to Gabby. I know the international organizations are not real popular with the administration, but they're critical. So apart from WHO struggle, there's still the global funds for vaccinations, global fund for HIV, malaria, AIDS, and then the whole agriculture input side of it. Girls' schools are hard. It's a matter of getting this support to the schools, but it's also getting family income. So what we found with RAIN in Niger is it's about family income. So in fact, a lot of the programs are about gardening, livestock. It's building up the income of the family so they can afford to have their kid, their daughter in particular, go to school. So that's a bit more complicated, but as important, it's just a little more complicated. This issue of malnutrition is just so critical because once a kid does not get nourishment, their IQ as well as their physical body is just really handicapped for the rest of their life. So that's my answer. But I haven't been in touch with Results, so I don't know what their campaign is advocating.
But you're doing a good job.
Results has certainly kept us up to date on all of those issues. So we appreciate both Results and you, Rebecca. So
Thank you, Counselor. Bill is also our town counselor, so I see him more as our neighbor and our
about a block away.
village councilman.
Yeah.
And I think we can have, if that's okay with you, Rebecca, one more question.
Sure. I'm not going anywhere like most people.
The rain has stopped here, so they're okay.
It hasn't rained in here. So we have one more question. If anybody would like to ask Ms. Rebecca. All right, I can actually ask a question, and not putting you on the spot or anything, but if you happen to give a recommendation to government in the state with what it has happened with talking about leadership and how in Africa and different countries they have been out there with their resolutions with COVID specifically, what recommendation would you give to the state?
One of the keys, I think, in the African countries was national leadership. I think there's been a lot of discussion about having that gap in the US and turned down to the states, but it was national leaders relying on their health experts, working in collaboration with the continent-wide health collaboration. So it's hard to replicate that here, but certainly have a stronger national view. And I know in South Africa, when they were discussing lifting the lockdown, they were doing a lot of analyses about which kids and which grades needed to move into the economy. Where would they go? And thinking through, maybe seniors in high school need to get into the economy, so they need to graduate. So maybe they should go back to school, but not the sophomores and juniors. And then looking at the impacts in an analytic way. So really trying to figure out what makes sense and having a much more holistic view. So I did want to say, South Africa is interesting because it does have much more sophisticated tracking system. So I suspect, I'm sure that some of the increase that's showing relative to the other countries is due to that. But also what's happening, a lot of the inequalities are coming up. Some of it is, frankly, a little bit of hubris on part of the government to think that their health system was more capable than it was. So relying on that more. But also just the inequities are being exacerbated. And South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. And it's just gotten worse because of this. And just the inability to cross that border between a highly sophisticated system for the well-off into those who aren't at all, and the concentration of the poor in these informal settlements. So I think that's an interesting case with a lot of ramifications for a country like the US, which also has our inequality problems. And how do you translate it across those?
That is correct. And it's 2:56. So if anybody else have another question, we just, would like to thank you so much for all the knowledge, for sharing, with us this fascinating presentation. Thank you for everything that you have done for the U.S. being in the Foreign Service. Thank you so much, Rebecca, and on behalf of the board of directors, which we have, of course, Jill, the president of Global Ties ABQ, the board of directors, we have Milora as well with us, and a lot of people that actually, it's constantly helping us. And, we exist because of Global Ties ABQ, because of the international relationships that are important around the world, specifically, of course, with the U.S., with the relationships with other countries around the world. And we have a lot of members. Thank you, Bill, so much for tuning in, and thank you to each one of you. Again, on behalf of the board of directors of Global Ties ABQ, Destiny and myself, which we are the only staff here in Global Ties ABQ, we thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, Rebecca, for your willingness to participate. And when I call you right away, yes, let's go ahead and do it. And thank you so much.
Really?
You're very welcome. And on France, I would highly recommend 2 very short videos by the famous documentary maker Greg Polk on the lockdown in Marseille and our escape to the US. So if you could show those for entertainment. They're about 2 minutes each, so very quick.
Thanks, Rebecca. Really quick, I wanted to shout out, we kind of skipped over a comment from Zlata about your track as a Foreign Service officer. And so I was just wondering, I don't think we have enough time, but would you feel comfortable sharing your email if anyone wanted to reach out and continue conversations?
I'm a big fan of trying to get people interested, seeing national foreign policy is not just a security interest, but a development and diplomacy interest. So very happy to talk about the Foreign Service, particularly about USAID, and can refer you to Ann Callahan to talk about the State Department. But yes, you have mine, so please feel free to send that out. And I'm always happy to talk about why Americans should care about the world and try and provide foreign assistance.
That is exactly right, Rebecca. Again, that's the reason why Global Ties has been in existence since 1963. So thank you so much once again, and I hope each one of you have a wonderful rest of your day, and just stay tuned for other conversations that we will have in the future. Thank you to each one of you. Thank you, Rebecca. Big hugs, virtual hugs to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for joining.
Bye, Rebecca.
Bye.
Thank you.